When I found my daughter living as a servant in the $8 million house I bought her, she did not even recognize me as her father. She just kept scrubbing the marble floor, looked at my steel toe boots, and whispered that she was sorry, calling me sir, promising she would clean it again. I did not scream. I did not cry. I calmly walked back outside, pulled out my phone, called my lawyer, and told him to freeze the trust because it was time for justice. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe nobody should get away with hurting family. My name is Harrison Cole, and I am 70 years old. I spent 7 grueling years working as a superintendent on an offshore oil rig in the freezing waters of the North Sea. I worked bone-chilling 12-hour shifts, breathing in toxic fumes. I did not do it because I loved the ocean. I did it because my wife Cynthia passed away suddenly, and I needed to ensure our only daughter Maya would never have to worry about a financial burden. 7 years ago, I bought Maya a beautiful estate in Hidden Hills, California. I paid $8 million in cold, hard cash. It was supposed to be her sanctuary, a safe place where she and her new husband Derek could build a life and be happy together. Derek was an investment broker. I never liked his slick suits and rehearsed smiles, but Maya loved him, so I supported them. I paid for the house, set up a trust fund, and packed my bags for the Atlantic, thinking I had done my job as a father. I wired money every month. We spoke on the phone regularly at first, though. Over the last 3 years, the calls grew shorter and less frequent. Derek always had an excuse. Maya was resting. Maya was at a retreat. Maya was dealing with severe anxiety. I finally decided I had endured enough of the freezing cold and the distance. I filed my retirement papers and flew back to California to surprise them. I wanted to walk through those doors and see the life my sweat had bought. I did not bother knocking when I arrived. I still had my original key. I pushed open the custom oak doors, expecting to feel the welcoming air of a happy home. Instead, the massive house was dead quiet. It was the specific kind of heavy quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand straight up. I set my bag down and walked slowly toward the grand foyer. As I moved, I heard a faint rhythmic scraping sound coming from the formal dining room. I stepped around the corner, a wide smile forming on my face, ready to call out my daughter's name. That smile died before it reached my eyes. There, down on her hands and knees, was a woman wearing a ragged gray uniform. She was violently scrubbing a dark red wine stain out of the marble floor with a cheap bristle brush. Her frame was shockingly skeletal, completely swallowed by the oversized fabric. Her hair, which used to be thick and vibrant, hung in greasy, uneven clumps around her hollow face. I took a hesitant step forward, confused, thinking maybe Derek had hired a cheap cleaning service. But as my steel toe boots clacked against the floor, the frail woman flinched. It was a violent spasm. She curled her delicate shoulders inward, acting exactly as if she expected to be struck. She slowly looked up from the wet floor. The breath left my lungs in an agonizing rush. It was Maya. My brilliant, beautiful, precious Maya. But the eyes staring back at me were completely dead. There was no recognition of the man standing right in front of her. I looked down at her, shaking hands. Those were the exact same hands that used to play Chopin flawlessly on the grand piano I had bought for her. Now those hands were raw red and covered in peeling blisters from harsh chemical bleach. Her fingernails were cracked and broken. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on my boots. Her whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm. She swallowed hard, clutching the scrub brush tightly, and spoke in a voice so raspy it shattered my heart. "I am sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking with pure terror. "I will clean it again right now. Please, I will make it spotless. Do not be angry with me, sir." My own flesh and blood was looking at me like I was a monster, begging me not to hurt her. My mind could not process the horror of what I was witnessing. I wanted to drop to my knees, wrap my arms around her frail body, and tell her that her father was home. I wanted to scream until my vocal cords tore. I reached out a trembling hand. Maya. I choked out, my voice thick with tears. It is me. It is Dad. She just let out a pathetic whimper and pushed herself backward against the wooden baseboards, squeezing her eyes shut tightly, as if she was bracing for an impact. Before I could take another step, a sudden noise echoed from the sweeping spiral staircase above us. It was a loud, booming, confident laugh. Derek's arrogant laugh. He was walking down the plush carpeted stairs, his voice echoing loudly through the grand entryway, oblivious to my silent presence. I immediately stepped backward, hiding in the deep shadows of the archway, my fists clenching until my knuckles turned white. Derek strolled confidently into the bright light, wearing a tailored navy blue suit, holding a crystal champagne flute. He looked healthier, richer, and more arrogant than I remembered. But he was not walking alone. Walking arm in arm with my son-in-law was a glamorous woman I had never seen before. She was laughing at something he said, twirling a manicured finger through her long blonde hair. She was wearing an emerald green dress, but the dress was not what caught my attention. Resting against her collarbone, catching the light from the crystal chandelier, was an antique emerald necklace. It was Cynthia's necklace. The necklace I had given my late wife on our 20th wedding anniversary, the same piece I gave Maya on her wedding day. My abused daughter was crawling on the floor in rags, bleeding and scrubbing their messes, while this strange woman paraded around my house wearing my dead wife's diamonds. The man I had trusted with my daughter's life was about to find out exactly what happens when you awaken a sleeping monster. I stood perfectly still in the cold shadows, watching them clink their champagne glasses together in a toast to their stolen luxury. I would let them enjoy their false victory for tonight, letting them believe they had successfully executed their perfect crime. Because starting tomorrow morning, I was going to systematically hunt them down, tear their lives apart, and save my only daughter. Derek stopped dead on the bottom step. For a fraction of a second, just a fleeting moment that most people would have missed, his face went completely pale. His eyes widened, and his hand gripped the wooden banister so hard I could see his knuckles turning white. But then, as quickly as the shock appeared, it vanished. A wide, meticulously crafted smile stretched across his face, a mask of pure, unadulterated fake joy. "Dad, you are back early!" Derek exclaimed, his voice booming with forced enthusiasm. He practically jumped off the last step and rushed toward me. Before I could even process the audacity of his greeting, he grabbed my shoulders in a firm, aggressive embrace, strategically positioning his body between me and Maya. "It is so good to see you. We were not expecting you for another month." I did not return the hug. I stood there stiff and rigid, my eyes glaring over his shoulder at the woman standing near the stairs. She was staring at me with a calculated, assessing look, and resting perfectly against her skin was my dead wife's emerald necklace, the very necklace I had clasped around Maya's neck on her wedding day. Derek noticed my stare and quickly cleared his throat, tightening his grip on my arm. He pulled me away from the entryway, forcefully steering me toward the mahogany doors of my study. "Come on in here, Dad. Let us talk. Let us get you a drink. You must be exhausted from the flight." I dug my heels into the marble, refusing to budge. I pointed a trembling finger at the woman in the gray rags, still cowering on the floor. "What is going on here, Derek? Why is my daughter scrubbing the floor in a maid's uniform? Why is she looking at me like she has never seen me before in her life?" Derek let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He rubbed his face with both hands, perfectly executing the look of an exhausted, heartbroken, and devoted husband. He gestured for the glamorous woman to join us. "Dad, this is Valerie. She is a top-tier live-in psychiatric nurse. She has been an absolute godsend for us during these dark times. I know this looks terrible. I know it looks shocking. But please come into the study. I will explain everything. Just let Valerie handle Maya for a moment. It is part of her routine." Valerie stepped forward with a polite professional nod. She did not look like any nurse I had ever seen on an oil rig or in a hospital. She smelled of expensive perfume and carried herself like the lady of the house. "Mr. Cole, it is a pleasure to finally meet you. Derek has told me so much about you. Please let me get Maya settled. It is best not to disrupt her current state." Against every instinct screaming in my brain, I allowed Derek to usher me into the study. He closed the heavy oak doors behind us, shutting out the sight of my shivering daughter. The study was exactly as I had designed it 7 years ago, with dark wood paneling walls lined with leather-bound books and a massive fireplace. But it felt tainted now. Derek walked over to the wet bar and poured a generous measure of scotch. He held the crystal tumbler out to me, his face etched with manufactured sorrow. I did not take the glass. I just stared at him, waiting. "It is Maya, Dad," he began, his voice dropping to a somber, trembling whisper. "She is very sick. I did not want to tell you while you were out on the rig. You were doing such dangerous work, and I knew how much you worried about her. I wanted to handle it. I promised you I would take care of her, and I have been trying my best." "What kind of sick?" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. Derek sat down on the edge of the leather sofa, resting his elbows on his knees. 4 years ago, while you were on your second rotation, Maya got pregnant. We were overjoyed. But there were complications. She suffered a severe late-term miscarriage. It was traumatic, Dad. Physically and mentally devastating. We lost the baby, and then I lost my wife. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, allowing the weight of his words to settle over me. I felt a sharp, agonizing twist in my chest. A grandchild. My daughter had lost a child, and I had been freezing on a steel platform thousands of miles away, completely unaware of her agony. The grief broke something inside her. Derek continued, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. The doctors diagnosed her with severe, untreatable, paranoid schizophrenia. It was triggered by the trauma. She lost her short-term memory. She started having terrifying hallucinations. She became a danger to herself, Dad. She tried to hurt herself multiple times. I sank into the chair opposite him, the breath knocked out of me. Schizophrenia. It sounded so clinical, so final. But why is she dressed like that? I asked, my voice barely a rasp. Why is my daughter scrubbing floors on her hands and knees? We have the money. I left you millions in the trust to hire the best care in the world. We did, Derek said, quickly leaning forward with an earnest, pleading expression. That is why Valerie is here. She is the best, the top specialist in the state, and the cleaning, Dad, that is actually part of her prescribed therapy. The doctors call it grounding. When Maya slips into a severe psychotic episode, when she loses her grip on reality, she needs repetitive menial labor to anchor her brain. The physical act of scrubbing, the repetitive motion, it calms her nervous system. It is the only thing that stops the night terrors. I stared at the expensive Persian rug beneath my feet. Derek's explanation was incredibly detailed, medically plausible, and delivered with such heartbreaking conviction. He sounded like a man who had spent years battling an invisible demon to save the woman he loved. He explained that they had to take away her nice clothes because she would tear them apart during her episodes. He claimed they gave her the uniform because it was durable and easy to replace. And the necklace, I asked, looking up at him. Why is the nurse wearing Cynthia's necklace? Derek did not even blink. He had an answer ready. Maya kept trying to swallow the stones, Dad. She thought they were medicine. Valerie wears it to keep it safe but visible because seeing it sometimes triggers a positive memory for Maya. It is a therapeutic tool. I swear to you, every single thing we are doing in this house is strictly for Maya's survival. I sat there in the quiet study, my heart aching with a profound, suffocating guilt. I had been away for 7 years. I had missed the most horrific tragedy of my daughter's life. I had left her alone with a husband who, by his own account, had sacrificed everything to keep her alive. I was on the verge of believing him. I was on the verge of breaking down in tears, of apologizing for my initial anger, of thanking this man for carrying the burden I should have carried. I looked at Derek, seeing him not as the slick broker I had always distrusted, but as a tragic, exhausted caretaker. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer my support, to tell him that we would get through this terrible nightmare together. But then the heavy study door swung open. It did not creak or open slowly. It flew open with the chaotic energy of a child. A little boy no older than 6 years old bounded into the room. He had a mop of messy brown hair, rosy cheeks, and dirt on the knees of his expensive jeans. He carried a plastic dinosaur toy in his small hand. He completely ignored the grand surroundings. He did not look at me. He did not even look at the woman in the gray rags who was still out in the hallway. Instead, he ran straight past Derek, sprinting toward the glamorous woman who had just stepped into the doorway behind him. "Mommy," the little boy yelled, throwing his arms around Valerie's legs. "I found my dinosaur in the garden. Can we watch a movie now?" Valerie froze. Her manicured hand hovered awkwardly in the air over the boy's head. I watched as the blood instantly drained from Derek's face. His smooth, confident facade shattered in a microscopic instant. His jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked frantically in his cheek. His eyes darted to me, filled with an unmistakable raw and absolute panic. The silence in the room was sudden and deafening, broken only by the innocent laughter of a child calling a nurse his mother in a house bought by my money, while my daughter scrubbed the floors outside. I did not say a word. I just looked at the boy. Then I looked at Derek, and the cold, hard truth began to claw its way out of the darkness. I needed every single ounce of discipline I had learned on the rigs to keep my hands at my sides. Every muscle in my body coiled, screaming at me to lunge across the mahogany desk, grab Derek by the collar of his tailored suit, and throw him through the expensive glass windows of the study. He stood there maintaining his tragic expression, entirely unaware of the violent storm raging inside my head. The boy was holding on to Valerie, burying his face in the expensive fabric of her dress, while my daughter was out in the hall, scrubbing the floor like a dog. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the skin nearly broke. I could not act now. If I exploded, if I showed them my hand, Derek would call the police. He would use his legal authority to ban me from the property, and he might disappear with Maya before I could build a case. I had to play the game. I had to be the broken, exhausted old man they thought I was. I forced my shoulders to slump. I let a heavy, trembling sigh escape my lips, rubbing my eyes as if the weight of the revelation had completely shattered my spirit. "You are right, Derek," I murmured, keeping my voice shaky and weak. "I am just so shocked. I had no idea she was this sick. I should not have barged in here without calling first. I was just so eager to see my little girl. But I see now that I have upset the balance. I am so sorry for disrupting her routine." Valerie exchanged a fleeting, triumphant glance with Derek. A smug, victorious little smile tugged at the corner of her painted lips before she quickly hid it behind a mask of professional concern. "It is quite all right, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "We know this is a difficult adjustment. Psychiatric care is complex, but we have everything under control." Derek visibly relaxed. The tension drained from his posture, and he moved toward the wet bar with the unearned confidence of a king in his castle. "Let us just take a deep breath, Dad," he said very smoothly. "It has been a long day for you. Let me pour you something to take the edge off." I watched in silent fury as he reached for a specific bottle on the top shelf. It was a 25-year-old Macallan. I recognized the label instantly. 7 years ago, when Derek launched his first independent brokerage firm, I bought that exact $2,000 bottle as a celebratory gift. I had handed it to him with a firm handshake, welcoming him into our family, telling him I believed in his potential to provide for Maya. Now this parasite was cracking open my gift, pouring my expensive scotch into my crystal tumblers inside the $8 million house I bought with my own blood and sweat. He handed me the glass. I took it, staring at the amber liquid. He took a long sip from his own glass, swirling it around, acting as if he owned the world. "I will go check into a hotel downtown tonight," I said softly, staring down at the floor to hide the lethal calculation in my eyes. "I do not want my presence to trigger any more episodes for Maya. I will stay away and let you and Valerie continue her therapy. You are doing a wonderful job, Derek. It takes a strong man to shoulder this burden." Derek actually puffed out his chest a little, soaking up the false praise. I am just doing what any good husband would do, Dad. She is my world. I will not give up on her. I nodded, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat. While Derek was busy performing his role as the martyred husband, the little boy who had been hiding behind Valerie's legs peeked out. He looked up at me with innocent curiosity, still clutching his plastic dinosaur. Valerie immediately placed a protective hand on his shoulder, trying to pull him back. Come along now, Leo, she said quickly, a hint of nervousness bleeding through her calm facade. Let us go upstairs and leave the adults to their conversation. But Leo did not move. He stepped forward, his small shoes sinking into the thick Persian rug. He tilted his head, staring at the worn steel toe boots I was wearing. I carry a few wrapped butterscotch candies in my heavy jacket pocket, a habit I picked up many years ago to keep my throat from drying out in the cold, salty ocean air. I slowly reached into my pocket, making sure my movements were slow and non-threatening. I crouched down to his eye level, balancing on the balls of my feet. Hello there, little man, I said, keeping my tone gentle and warm. That is a mighty fine dinosaur you have there. Are you a brave explorer? Leo smiled, a bright, genuine smile that instantly reminded me of Maya when she was that age. Yes, he chirped proudly. I found him in the dirt. He is a fierce hunter. I chuckled, pulling the butterscotch candy from my pocket and holding it out in my open palm. Well, fierce hunters need energy. Would you like a piece of candy? Valerie stepped forward quickly, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floorboards. He really should not be eating sweets right now, she interjected, reaching down to grab his hand. But Leo had already taken another confident step closer to me, reaching out his small fingers to take the wrapped candy. As he took it, he looked directly into my face. The lighting in the study was dim, but a beam of afternoon sunlight was piercing through the tall bay windows, illuminating his small features perfectly. I froze. The breath completely left my lungs. I forgot where I was. I forgot about Derek standing by the bar. I forgot about Valerie hovering nervously above us. I just stared into the eyes of this 6-year-old boy. His left eye was a piercing, icy blue. His right eye was a deep, vivid, beautiful emerald green. It was striking heterochromia. It was not just a random genetic mutation. It was the exact, incredibly rare genetic trait that had belonged to my late wife, Cynthia. I stared into those eyes, feeling a shockwave of realization crash through my entire body. I slowly shifted my gaze to Valerie. She had dark, flat brown eyes. I looked over at Derek. He had standard, unremarkable brown eyes. It is biologically impossible for two brown-eyed parents to produce a child with this exact, specific genetic anomaly. It was a complete mathematical impossibility. I looked back down at the little boy happily unwrapping the butterscotch. My hands began to tremble, not from old age, but from the horrifying weight of the truth. The sad story about the tragic late-term miscarriage was a complete lie. The precious baby did not die. That boy, little Leo, standing right in front of me, calling the fake nurse his mother, was Maya's biological son. When I forced myself to stand up from the heavy leather armchair, I had to grip my cane tightly to steady my shaking legs. I told Derek that the jet lag had finally caught up to me, that I needed to rest my tired bones in a quiet hotel room for the night. I promised I would return the next day when everyone was properly rested. Derek walked me to the front door, his hand resting comfortably on my back, playing the part of the perfect, caring son-in-law. He even offered to drive me, but I firmly declined, claiming I had already arranged for a rental car. Walking out of that house and leaving my daughter behind was the hardest thing I have ever had to do in my 70 years on this earth. Every step felt like walking through wet cement. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to snatch my grandson and my daughter, and to break Derek's jaw. But I knew that acting on pure rage would ruin everything. Derek had legal authority. He had the narrative. I needed proof. I checked into a sterile, quiet hotel room a few miles down the highway. I did not even bother turning on the lights or unzipping my suitcase. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, staring at the blank wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. Decades of working on offshore oil rigs had given me a sixth sense for impending disaster. Out on the dark, unforgiving ocean right before a high-pressure pipe bursts or a rig's structural support gives way, there is always a subtle shift in the air. A sudden drop in temperature. A strange, unnatural vibration in the steel grating beneath your boots. Your brain registers the danger long before your eyes see the explosion. Right now, sitting in that quiet hotel room, my internal alarms were blaring with deafening intensity. Everything Derek had told me was a meticulously crafted script. The tragic miscarriage, the sudden incurable schizophrenia, the live-in psychiatric nurse. It was all a calculated performance designed to placate a grieving father and secure his absolute control over my money. Yeah, I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was flashing in bright red numbers. 11 o'clock. I knew I could not simply wait for the morning to investigate. I needed to see what happened inside that house when they thought nobody was watching. I changed out of my travel clothes and pulled on a thick, dark wool sweater and a pair of heavy cargo pants. I laced up my steel toe boots, grabbed a small, powerful tactical flashlight from my duffel bag, and headed back out into the chilling night air. I drove my rental car back toward the exclusive gated neighborhood of Hidden Hills. I knew better than to drive directly up to the main gate. The security cameras would record my license plate, and the guards would likely alert the residents. Instead, I parked 2 blocks away on a quiet, unlit public street. I zipped my jacket up to my chin and stepped into the thick woods that bordered the sprawling estates. The California night was uncharacteristically freezing, the wind biting through the trees with a sharp, bitter edge. I hiked through the dense, tangled underbrush, relying on the faint moonlight to guide my path. Branches scratched against my sleeves, and dry leaves crunched softly beneath my boots, but I moved with the steady, quiet discipline of a man on a mission. It took me nearly 40 minutes to navigate the rough terrain and reach the back perimeter of my property. I found a dense cluster of tall hedges just beyond the wrought iron fence that separated the manicured lawn from the wild woods. I crouched down in the freezing mud, my knees aching from the damp cold, and focused my gaze on the back of the massive mansion. The house was completely dark. The tall glass windows reflected nothing but the pale moonlight. For a long time there was absolutely no movement, just the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant rhythmic hum of the pool filter. I waited. The cold seeped through my heavy clothing, stiffening my joints, but I refused to leave my vantage point. I was not leaving until I understood the true nature of my daughter's nightmare. The glowing red numbers on my watch shifted to 2 in the morning, just as my muscles began to cramp from holding the awkward position in the dirt. A sudden blinding flash of light shattered the darkness. The harsh, bright security lights illuminating the sprawling back patio snapped on, casting a stark, artificial glare over the pristine swimming pool and the imported stone deck. I held my breath, pressing my body deeper into the frozen hedges. The heavy glass sliding doors opened with a loud scrape. Valerie stepped out into the freezing night air. She was no longer wearing the elegant emerald dress. Instead, she wore a thick, luxurious cashmere sweater and tight leggings. But it was not Valerie that made my blood run cold. Dragged behind her, stumbling over the metal track of the sliding door, was Maya. My daughter was still wearing that thin, ragged gray maid's uniform. She was shivering violently, her bare arms covered in goosebumps, her head bowed in absolute submission. Valerie marched across the stone deck, pulling a large, heavy plastic bucket behind her. She stopped near the edge of the pool and violently kicked the bucket over. A rush of dark, icy, dirty mop water spilled across the pristine stones, creating a massive, filthy puddle. Valerie pointed a manicured finger at the mess. "Clean it," she barked, her voice harsh and devoid of any professional medical tone. Maya did not hesitate. She dropped to her bare knees on the freezing hard stones. She pulled a small, coarse scrub brush from the pocket of her apron and began to frantically scrub the icy water. Her movements were erratic, desperate, and driven by pure terror. She scrubbed until her knuckles scraped against the rough stone, her frail body shaking so hard I could see her ribs jutting out against the thin fabric of her uniform. Valerie did not offer her a towel or a kind word. Instead, she walked over to an outdoor lounge chair, sat down, and picked up a martini glass from the side table. She took a slow, leisurely sip of her drink, watching my daughter scrub the freezing floor like a captive animal. Valerie let out a high, cruel laugh, a sound that echoed across the quiet yard and pierced straight through my soul. She was enjoying this. This was not a grounding medical therapy. This was torture. This was systematic, deliberate, sadistic abuse designed to break a human being down into nothingness. I gripped the iron bars of the fence, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. I was seconds away from tearing the gate open, charging across the lawn, and ending Valerie's miserable existence with my bare hands. I felt the adrenaline pumping through my veins, hot and demanding action. But then the glass sliding doors opened a second time. Derek stepped out onto the patio. He was wearing a dark silk robe, his hair slightly rumpled from sleep. He did not look concerned about the freezing temperature or the fact that his supposedly severely ill wife was outside in the middle of the night scrubbing dirty water off the pavement. He walked straight past Maya without even glancing down at her. He moved directly to the lounge chair where Valerie was sitting. Derek leaned over, wrapped his arms tightly around Valerie's waist, and pulled her up against his chest. Right there in the bright glare of the patio lights, my son-in-law kissed the fake psychiatric nurse passionately. He ran his hands through her blonde hair, smiling against her lips. I stared in absolute horror as the final pieces of their twisted puzzle snapped into place. They were completely brazen. They did not care who saw them because they believed they were untouchable. I slowly shifted my gaze back to my daughter. Maya was kneeling less than 10 feet away from them. The icy water was soaking through her thin uniform, freezing her to the bone. Her husband was kissing another woman right in front of her. But Maya did not look up. She did not cry out. She did not show a single ounce of anger, betrayal, or sorrow. She just kept her dead, hollow eyes fixed firmly on the ground, and she kept scrubbing. I did not sleep that night. I stumbled back through the freezing woods to my rental car, my chest hollowed out by the sheer cruelty I had just witnessed. When I finally reached my sterile hotel room, I sat on the edge of the mattress and watched the pale light of dawn slowly creep through the blinds. Every instinct in my body urged me to call the police, to kick down the heavy oak doors of that mansion and drag Derek out into the street by his throat. But I knew the law. Derek held a medical power of attorney. He had the forged documents. He had the fake psychiatric nurse to corroborate his lies. If I acted out of blind fury, they would claim I was a grieving, delusional father having a violent episode. They would lock me out, and I would never see my daughter again. I needed concrete evidence. I needed to bridge the gap between the heavily medicated ghost I had seen and the brilliant woman I raised. I had to speak to Maya alone, away from their watchful eyes. By 7 in the morning, I was parked 2 blocks away from the estate. I pulled up my jacket collar against the damp morning fog and walked quietly toward the service alleyway running behind the neighborhood properties. The high stone walls of the mansion separated the pristine, manicured lawns from the industrial dumpsters where the garbage collection took place. I knew the layout perfectly because I had reviewed every blueprint when I purchased the property 7 years ago. There was a blind spot right behind the heavy iron service gate, totally hidden from the property's main security cameras. I positioned myself behind a large concrete pillar blending into the morning shadows and waited. The chill of the concrete seeped through my jacket, but I stood completely still. I waited for over an hour, listening to the distant sounds of the wealthy neighborhood waking up. Finally, I heard the heavy clanking of the service gate being unlatched. The heavy iron hinges groaned open with a loud metallic screech. Maya stumbled out into the damp alleyway. She was dragging 2 massive black garbage bags across the asphalt. In the unforgiving light of the morning sun, Her physical condition was even more horrifying than it had been in the dim hallway the day before. Her uniform hung off her frail collarbones. Her bare arms were bruised and marked with fresh, angry red scratches. She was panting heavily, struggling with the weight of the bags, her movements slow and incredibly lethargic. Her head hung low, her unbrushed hair hiding her face as she hoisted the first bag into the large metal dumpster. She moved like a machine with a dying battery completely devoid of any human spark. When she reached for the second bag, I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar. I did not move quickly. I did not want to startle her. I took a single deliberate step onto the gravel. The sound of my steel toe boots crunching against the loose stones echoed in the quiet alleyway. Maya gasped. She dropped the plastic bag, spinning around with a violent jerk. The moment she saw a tall man standing in the alleyway, she collapsed against the cold metal of the dumpster. She threw both of her blistered hands over her head, curling her body into a tight ball, cowering like a beaten animal, expecting a physical blow. "Please," she whimpered, her voice raspy and broken. "I am sorry. I will go back inside. I am sorry." I stopped immediately. I held my hands up, showing her my empty palms, keeping my distance. I did not rush toward her. I did not try to touch her. I knew her mind was trapped in a chemical prison clouded by whatever toxic substances Valerie was forcing down her throat. Calling out her name would only confuse her more. I had to bypass the logic center of her drugged brain and reach straight for her soul. I had to find a memory so deeply ingrained that no pharmaceutical poison could erase it. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began to hum. It was not a popular song. It was a very specific, obscure French lullaby that Cynthia used to sing to Maya every night when she was 5 years old. It was a melody from Cynthia's own childhood, something completely unique to our family. I hummed the gentle rising notes, keeping my voice steady and low. The soft melody drifted through the cold morning air, cutting through the silence of the alleyway. Maya stopped trembling. Her hands slowly lowered from her face. She looked up at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. I kept humming the second verse, locking my eyes with hers. A massive, agonizing shift happened within her expression. The dead, hollow stare fractured. A spark of pure, desperate recognition flashed in her eyes. The heavy fog of the medication seemed to part for a fraction of a second. Her lower lip quivered, and a single tear traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. She tried to speak. She opened her mouth, her jaw trembling violently as her brain fought a brutal war against the sedatives running through her veins. Her tongue was slurred, moving thickly inside her mouth. "Da," she choked out the syllable, barely audible over the morning breeze. "Da." She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting with everything she had to form the word, her hands gripping the fabric of her ragged uniform. She knew exactly who I was. My daughter was still in there, buried beneath layers of chemical restraints and psychological torture. She took a tiny, shaky step toward me, reaching out a trembling, blistered hand. I wanted to grab her, pull her into my arms, and run straight to the hospital. I wanted to end this nightmare right now. I took a step forward, ready to carry her away from this prison. "Maya." The sharp, shrill voice echoed from the open iron gate. It was Valerie. "What is taking you so long? Get back in here right now." Maya flinched as if she had been struck by lightning. The spark of recognition in her eyes was instantly swallowed by sheer blinding panic. She lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a frantic blur. She did not hug me. Instead, she grabbed my right hand and aggressively shoved a small, crumpled piece of paper deep into my palm. She squeezed my fingers shut over it, gave me one last look of absolute terror, and turned around, sprinting clumsily back through the gate before Valerie could step into the alleyway. I stood alone in the cold shadows, listening to the heavy iron gate slam shut. I slowly opened my clenched fist. The crumpled paper was a stiff cocktail napkin from the house. I smoothed out the wrinkled edges. It was not filled with the chaotic, paranoid gibberish of a schizophrenic mind. Written across the white paper in a dark, rusty red fluid clearly drawn using her own blood were three desperate words. They took Leo. I did not sleep that night. I stumbled back through the freezing woods to my rental car, my chest hollowed out by the sheer cruelty I had just witnessed. When I finally reached my sterile hotel room, I sat on the edge of the mattress and watched the pale light of dawn slowly creep through the blinds. Every instinct in my body urged me to call the police to kick down the heavy oak doors of that mansion and drag Derek out into the street by his throat. But I knew the law. Derek held a medical power of attorney. He had the forged documents. He had the fake psychiatric nurse to corroborate his lies. If I acted out of blind fury, they would claim I was a grieving, delusional father having a violent episode. They would lock me out, and I would never see my daughter again. I needed concrete evidence. I needed to bridge the gap between the heavily medicated ghost I had seen and the brilliant woman I raised. I had to speak to Maya alone, away from their watchful eyes. By 7 in the morning, I was parked 2 blocks away from the estate. I pulled up my jacket collar against the damp morning fog and walked quietly toward the service alleyway running behind the neighborhood properties. The high stone walls of the mansion separated the pristine manicured lawns from the industrial dumpsters where the garbage collection took place. I knew the layout perfectly because I had reviewed every blueprint when I purchased the property 7 years ago. There was a blind spot right behind the heavy iron service gate, totally hidden from the property's main security cameras. I positioned myself behind a large concrete pillar, blending into the morning shadows, and waited. The chill of the concrete seeped through my jacket, but I stood completely still. I waited for over an hour, listening to the distant sounds of the wealthy neighborhood waking up. Finally, I heard the heavy clanking of the service gate being unlatched. The heavy iron hinges groaned open with a loud metallic screech. Maya stumbled out into the damp alleyway. She was dragging 2 massive black garbage bags across the asphalt. In the unforgiving light of the morning sun, her physical condition was even more horrifying than it had been in the dim hallway the day before. Her uniform hung off her frail collarbones. Her bare arms were bruised and marked with fresh, angry red scratches. She was panting heavily, struggling with the weight of the bags, her movements slow and incredibly lethargic. Her head hung low, her unbrushed hair hiding her face as she hoisted the first bag into the large metal dumpster. She moved like a machine with a dying battery completely devoid of any human spark. When she reached for the second bag, I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar. I did not move quickly. I did not want to startle her. I took a single deliberate step onto the gravel. The sound of my steel toe boots crunching against the loose stones echoed in the quiet alleyway. Maya gasped. She dropped the plastic bag, spinning around with a violent jerk. The moment she saw a tall man standing in the alleyway, she collapsed against the cold metal of the dumpster. She threw both of her blistered hands over her head, curling her body into a tight ball, cowering like a beaten animal, expecting a physical blow. "Please," she whimpered, her voice raspy and broken. "I am sorry. I will go back inside. I am sorry." I stopped immediately. I held my hands up, showing her my empty palms, keeping my distance. I did not rush toward her. I did not try to touch her. I knew her mind was trapped in a chemical prison clouded by whatever toxic substances Valerie was forcing down her throat. Calling out her name would only confuse her more. I had to bypass the logic center of her drugged brain and reach straight for her soul. I had to find a memory so deeply ingrained that no pharmaceutical poison could erase it. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began to hum. It was not a popular song. It was a very specific, obscure French lullaby that Cynthia used to sing to Maya every night when she was 5 years old. It was a melody from Cynthia's own childhood, something completely unique to our family. I hummed the gentle rising notes, keeping my voice steady and low. The soft melody drifted through the cold morning air, cutting through the silence of the alleyway. Maya stopped trembling. Her hands slowly lowered from her face. She looked up at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. I kept humming the second verse, locking my eyes with hers. A massive, agonizing shift happened within her expression. The dead, hollow stare fractured. A spark of pure, desperate recognition flashed in her eyes. The heavy fog of the medication seemed to part for a fraction of a second. Her lower lip quivered, and a single tear traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. She tried to speak. She opened her mouth, her jaw trembling violently as her brain fought a brutal war against the sedatives running through her veins. Her tongue was slurred, moving thickly inside her mouth. Duh, she choked out the syllable barely audible over the morning breeze. Duh. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting with everything she had to form the word, her hands gripping the fabric of her ragged uniform. She knew exactly who I was. My daughter was still in there, buried beneath layers of chemical restraints and psychological torture. She took a tiny, shaky step toward me, reaching out a trembling, blistered hand. I wanted to grab her, pull her into my arms, and run straight to the hospital. I wanted to end this nightmare right now. I took a step forward, ready to carry her away from this prison. Maya, the sharp, shrill voice echoed from the open iron gate. It was Valerie. What is taking you so long? Get back in here right now. Maya flinched as if she had been struck by lightning. The spark of recognition in her eyes was instantly swallowed by sheer, blinding panic. She lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a frantic blur. She did not hug me. Instead, she grabbed my right hand and aggressively shoved a small, crumpled piece of paper deep into my palm. She squeezed my fingers shut over it, gave me one last look of absolute terror, and turned around, sprinting clumsily back through the gate before Valerie could step into the alleyway. I stood alone in the cold shadows, listening to the heavy iron gate slam shut. I slowly opened my clenched fist. The crumpled paper was a stiff cocktail napkin from the house. I smoothed out the wrinkled edges. It was not filled with the chaotic, paranoid gibberish of a schizophrenic mind. Written across the white paper in a dark, rusty red fluid clearly drawn using her own blood were 3 desperate words. They took Leo. Those 3 words burned themselves into my retinas. They took Leo. My daughter was not suffering from a psychotic break. She was not trapped in a schizophrenic delusion. She was a hostage in the very sanctuary I had purchased to keep her safe. The heavy, suffocating fog of confusion that had clouded my mind since I stepped off the plane instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute certainty. I carefully folded the blood-stained napkin and placed it into the breast pocket of my jacket, pressing it flat against my heart. I turned away from the towering stone walls of the estate and began the long walk back to my rental car. My steps were no longer heavy with grief. They were measured, precise, and driven by a singular, dangerous purpose. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and turned the heater on full blast to chase the damp morning chill from my bones. I did not drive back to the hotel. I pulled out onto the highway and headed straight for the financial district of downtown Los Angeles. As I navigated the congested morning traffic, my grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. I thought about the sheer arrogance of the man I had trusted with my daughter's future. Derek had looked me in the eye, drank my expensive scotch, and fed me a carefully rehearsed tragedy, while my daughter bled and scrubbed the stones of her own home. I did not spend 40 years of my life inhaling toxic fumes, dodging heavy swinging drill pipes, and freezing in the brutal gales of the North Sea just to let a silver-tongued parasite destroy my bloodline. I had sacrificed my own comfort, missing birthdays and anniversaries, trading my physical health for hazard pay, all to build an impenetrable financial fortress for Maya. I had poured every drop of my sweat into a trust fund designed to shield her from the harsh realities of the world. Now some slick broker in a tailored suit thought he could simply step in, hijack my life's work, and break my daughter like a toy. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I arrived at the towering glass and steel building that housed my wealth management attorney. Jonathan had been managing my legal affairs for over 20 years. He was a sharp, meticulous lawyer who knew the exact structure of my assets, the trust I had established, and the strict conditions of the $8 million estate. I strode past the polished marble reception desk, ignoring the protests of the young administrative assistant who tried to tell me I needed an appointment. I pushed open the heavy glass door to Jonathan's corner office and stepped inside without bothering to knock. Jonathan was sitting behind his massive desk, reviewing a stack of printed contracts. He looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion, but his annoyance quickly shifted to profound shock when he recognized my face. "Harrison," he said quickly, standing up and hurriedly buttoning his suit jacket. "I had no idea you were back from the rig. We did not have a meeting scheduled for today. Is everything all right?" I closed the heavy office door behind me, making sure it clicked shut securely. I walked over to his desk and leaned over the polished wood, resting my weight on my hands. "Nothing is right, Jonathan," I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly level. "I need you to pull every single public record property deed and trust document associated with my daughter and her husband. I want to see every financial movement, every legal filing, and every signature recorded in the county database over the last 4 years." Jonathan frowned, clearly taken aback by the fierce intensity in my eyes. "Harrison, please sit down. What exactly is going on? Did Derek mismanage the maintenance funds? I received the annual property tax payments on schedule, so I assumed everything at the estate was operating normally. What has he done?" I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the crumpled, blood-stained napkin, and placed it on the pristine surface of his desk. I did not offer a long, emotional explanation. I gave him the cold, hard facts. "Maya is not suffering from a psychiatric breakdown," I told him, watching his eyes widen as he read the desperate message. "She is being held hostage in her own home. Derek has hired a fake nurse. They are keeping her heavily sedated, forcing her to do manual labor, and they are using my grandson as leverage to keep her compliant. I need to know exactly how much legal authority Derek has managed to steal while I was out on the ocean." Jonathan did not ask any more questions. The color completely drained from his face as the gravity of the horrific situation settled over him. He immediately sat back down, slid his keyboard closer, and began typing rapidly. The rhythmic clicking of the keys filled the silent office. I paced back and forth across the thick carpet, my mind racing through all the possible scenarios. I expected to hear that Derek had drained her checking accounts. I expected to find out he had taken out a second mortgage or perhaps leveraged the estate to fund his failing investments. I was prepared for severe financial ruin. Money could be replaced. Money was just numbers on a bright screen, but the heavy silence stretching across the room told me that the situation was far worse than a simple case of embezzlement. The clicking of the keyboard abruptly stopped. I turned around to look at Jonathan. He was staring at his computer monitor, completely frozen. His mouth was slightly open, and his hands were trembling as they hovered over the desk. The professional, composed lawyer I had known for 2 decades looked as if he had just witnessed a ghost. "What is it?" I demanded, walking back over to the desk. "How much money did he steal from the trust? Did he mortgage the house?" Jonathan slowly turned the large computer monitor toward me. He did not speak right away. He seemed to be struggling to find the words to explain the absolute horror displayed on the screen. "Harrison," he finally whispered, his voice shaking with profound disbelief. "Derek has not just taken over the financial accounts. He has not just mortgaged the house. He has taken absolute, irrevocable control of everything." I leaned in, squinting at the dense legal jargon filling the bright screen. It was a file from the county probate court. The document was a petition for a permanent conservatorship. Jonathan pointed a trembling finger at the second paragraph of the legal filing. 2 years ago, Derek filed an emergency petition with the court. Jonathan explained, his voice thick with dread. He claimed that Maya suffered a total psychological collapse due to immense grief. "Grief over your death, Harrison. 2 years ago, Derek submitted a heavily authenticated forged international death certificate to a California judge. He claimed you were killed in a catastrophic explosion on an offshore oil rig in the North Sea, using your remote job to seal his absolute control. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling the temperature in the room plummet. Dead. I was legally dead. Derek had completely erased my existence with a few sheets of forged paper. He knew the isolation of an offshore oil rig meant I would not be checking my credit score or reading California probate notices. Jonathan sat frozen, his hands trembling as he stared at the horrible truth. He asked me if I wanted to call the federal authorities right now to bring down a massive hammer of fraud charges on Derek. I shook my head, my voice eerily calm despite the violent storm raging in my chest. Not yet, I told him. If we show our hand too early, Derek might panic. He might flee the country with my grandson. Or worse, he could use his legal conservatorship to authorize a lethal medical intervention for Maya before the police even breach the gates. I need to know every single thing happening inside that house. I need eyes and ears in every room to capture his entire network of lies before we strike. I left Jonathan in his office with strict orders to prepare the legal artillery, and I drove straight back into the heart of Los Angeles. 7 years ago, when I first bought the Hidden Hills estate, I spared absolutely no expense to ensure my daughter would be safe. I did not just buy a fancy alarm system. I paid $150,000 for a military-grade, state-of-the-art smart home surveillance network. It was designed by a private security firm that handled threat assessment for high-level corporate executives and foreign diplomats. The system included hidden microphones built directly into the crown molding, highly sensitive acoustic motion sensors, and microscopic camera lenses embedded seamlessly into the smoke detectors of every major room. When Derek officially moved in, he immediately changed all the digital passwords and user codes, claiming he valued their marital privacy. He manually disabled the local administrative access panels on the property, assuming he had permanently locked me out of the digital architecture forever. What that arrogant, thieving broker did not realize was that I never actually transferred the primary legal ownership of the security contract. I was still listed as the sole master account holder on all the foundational corporate records. I parked my rental car in front of a sleek, unmarked glass building located deep in the bustling business district. The elite security firm operated quietly from the shadows, completely without flashy corporate logos or bright neon signs. I walked swiftly through the automatic sliding doors and approached the pristine front reception desk. The administrative receptionist immediately asked for my identification. I handed her my passport and my original heavy paper account documents from 7 years ago. She scanned the thick paperwork, her professional smile faltering slightly when my full name popped up on her glowing computer monitor. She politely asked me to wait, and nervously disappeared into a secure back room. A few minutes later, the director of operations, a stern, heavily built man named Marcus, who I had worked with 7 years ago, walked into the main lobby. He looked at me exactly as if he had just seen a walking ghost. He quickly admitted that they had received a formal notice of my death 2 years ago from my son-in-law, who had subsequently requested a complete transfer of the system credentials. I leaned heavily across the front desk, looking him dead in the eye, and told him that the official reports of my tragic death had been greatly exaggerated. I demanded my master access be reinstated immediately. Marcus did not argue with me. He brought me back to a highly secure server room, carefully verified my biological data, and completely overrode his digital blockade with a few keystrokes. Within 20 minutes, I possessed the encrypted master keys to the entire estate network. I drove back to my sterile hotel room, my pulse thrumming with a dark, heavy, and extremely dangerous anticipation. I sat at the small wooden desk near the window, flipped open my heavily encrypted laptop, and logged directly into the security firm and its private online portal. I typed in the complex master credentials. The screen went entirely black for a fraction of a second before suddenly blooming into bright life. A massive grid containing 20 high-definition live video feeds immediately populated my computer screen. I was instantly transported back inside the walls of my own house. I could clearly see the grand marble foyer where I had first found my daughter. I could see the expansive, beautiful kitchen with its custom-imported countertops. I could see the dark, heavy mahogany panels of the study where Derek had blatantly lied to my face. The dormant cameras had silently awakened, remaining invisible and entirely undetected by the violent parasites currently living within the estate. I plugged a pair of heavy studio headphones into the audio jack, slowly adjusting the volume until the ambient sounds of the mansion filled my ears. I could hear the faint rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning unit. I could hear the distant splashing water of the massive pool filter running outside. I systematically clicked through the various camera feeds, desperately searching for any sign of my daughter or my young grandson. My cursor hovered directly over the specific feed labeled as the master bedroom. I clicked the small icon, rapidly expanding the high-definition video to fill my entire monitor. The hidden camera was angled perfectly from the upper corner of the ceiling, capturing the massive king-sized bed and the sweeping glass balcony doors. Derek was pacing back and forth across the plush carpet. He was wearing his tailored dark trousers and a loose white shirt, holding his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. He was speaking in a rapid, hushed tone, his free hand gesturing aggressively in the empty air. I leaned forward, pressing the heavy headphones hard against my ears, filtering out every single other sound in the world, just to focus entirely on his voice. He was talking to a real estate developer. I could hear the harsh metallic rasp of an angry voice on the other end of the private line, asking about a sudden delay in some massive financial transaction. Derek abruptly stopped pacing and ran a hand through his carefully styled hair. "Listen to me," Derek said, his voice dripping with a terrifying, absolute cold certainty. "I told you the capital is secure. Do not worry about the crazy wife. Her mental condition is rapidly deteriorating, just as we originally planned. The legal paperwork is completely ironclad. Once we close the $5 million home equity line of credit next week, I am transferring her directly to a state ward. She will be locked away in a psychiatric facility, kept completely sedated at all times. She will not be an issue for us anymore, and the old man is already legally dead and permanently buried deep in the system. The money will be wired directly into the offshore accounts by Friday. Just have the contracts ready for my signature." I ripped the heavy studio headphones off my ears and threw them onto the hotel desk. The smooth leather slapped against the wood, but the sound barely registered over the roaring in my ears. I stared at the glowing monitor, watching Derek casually end his phone call and walk back into the master bathroom, as if he had just ordered takeout instead of condemning my daughter to a permanent state ward. A $5 million home equity line of credit. He was going to drain the remaining value of the Hidden Hills estate, wire the money to untraceable offshore accounts, and lock Maya away in a psychiatric facility where nobody would ever hear her voice again. He had manufactured a reality where I was dead, his wife was violently insane, and he was the tragic hero cashing out his reward. The sheer, calculated evil of it paralyzed me for a long moment. I pressed my palms against my eyes, fighting a wave of pure, suffocating nausea. I had given this man the keys to my daughter's future, and he had used them to build her a torture chamber. I checked the digital clock on the nightstand. It was exactly midnight. The silence in the hotel room was absolute, heavy with the weight of the dark secrets I was uncovering. Just as the numbers shifted to 1 minute past midnight, 3 sharp, rhythmic knocks echoed from the solid wooden door. I stood up, my steel toe boots making no sound on the thick carpet, and walked to the door. I looked through the brass peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Robert, the elite private investigator I had hired immediately after leaving my attorney's office earlier that afternoon. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Robert stepped inside without saying a single word. He was wearing a dark trench coat, his expression grave and unreadable. He carried a thick, heavy manila envelope tucked tightly under his left arm. I locked the door behind him and motioned toward the small seating area near the window. Robert sat down and placed the thick manila envelope onto the glass coffee table. The yellow paper seemed to glow under the harsh hotel lighting. I had tasked Robert with two impossible jobs. First, I needed absolute biological proof of the little boy's parentage. Second, I needed to know exactly what kind of chemical poison was keeping my daughter trapped in a state of living death. When Maya had dropped those heavy black garbage bags in the alleyway that morning, she had unknowingly handed me everything I needed. Robert and his team had intercepted the municipal trash pickup, recovering the bags Maya had dragged out. Inside those bags, they found a discarded plastic hairbrush tangled with long, dark strands of Maya's hair and a discarded juice box with little Leo's saliva on the straw. Combined with the rusty dried blood from the cocktail napkin Maya had pressed into my palm, the rapid testing laboratory had more than enough genetic material to work with. I did not sit down. I stood towering over the glass table, staring at the thick envelope as if it were an unexploded bomb. Robert looked up at me, his seasoned eyes filled with a rare, heavy sympathy. "I paid extra to have the technicians rush the analysis, Harrison," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The results are completely conclusive. I suggest you brace yourself before you read the toxicology screening." I reached down and picked up the envelope. The paper was rough against my calloused fingertips. I unclasped the metal fastener and pulled out the thick stack of stark white laboratory reports. I flipped directly to the first page. It was the genetic paternity and maternity analysis. The stark black text confirmed what my gut had been screaming since the moment I saw those piercing, mismatched eyes in the study. The probability of maternity was a solid 99.9%. Little Leo, the boy Derek had proudly paraded around the house, the boy calling Valerie his mother, was unequivocally Maya's biological son. The tragic story of the late-term miscarriage was a complete fabricated lie designed to explain away the absence of a baby while they secretly kept him hidden on the estate. They had stolen her child, erased her reality, and forced her to live as a servant in the presence of her own flesh and blood. The agonizing pain I felt for my daughter was suddenly eclipsed by a profound, terrifying protective instinct for my grandson. I swallowed hard, the dry air scratching the back of my throat, and flipped to the second section of the dossier. This was the comprehensive toxicology report pulled from the root follicles of the hair retrieved from the trash. I scanned the long list of chemical compounds, expecting to see a cocktail of heavy psychiatric medications used to treat severe paranoid schizophrenia. Derek had stood in my study and confidently declared that Maya was suffering from untreatable violent delusions. He claimed she needed aggressive medical intervention to survive her own mind. I read the results once and then I read them a second time, my vision blurring at the edges. I looked up at Robert, my hands shaking so violently the paper rattled in the quiet room. "There is nothing here," I whispered, my voice sounding completely foreign to my own ears. "There is absolutely no trace of any recognized schizophrenia medication. There are no standard antipsychotics, no mood stabilizers, no typical therapeutic drugs." Robert slowly shook his head, his face a grim mask of controlled anger. "No, Harrison, there is not," he confirmed quietly. "They are not treating her for a psychiatric condition because she does not have one. Look closer at the second page. Look at the specific chemical compounds the laboratory isolated in the deepest layers of her hair follicles." I turned the page. Highlighted in bright, harsh yellow ink were two specific, highly regulated chemical compounds: haloperidol and rohypnol. I felt a cold, paralyzing dread wash over my entire body. I knew exactly what those potent drugs were. Anyone who has spent time working in the rough, dangerous port cities of the world knows exactly what those specific chemicals do to a human brain. Haloperidol is a massive, incredibly potent tranquilizer, typically used as a severe chemical restraint to completely sedate highly aggressive patients. It strips away a person's motor functions, leaving them physically exhausted, compliant, and completely unable to fight back against an attacker. Rohypnol is a severe central nervous system depressant, commonly known for inducing profound total amnesia. It wipes the short-term memory entirely clean, leaving the victim profoundly confused, totally disoriented, and highly susceptible to any dark suggestion. Derek and Valerie were not treating my beloved daughter for an illness. They were chemically lobotomizing her every single day. They were keeping her trapped in a manufactured nightmare, forcefully stripping away her memories and her strength so she would never remember who she was or realize that her beautiful son was living just upstairs. The sheer, unimaginable cruelty of their daily routine finally broke the last remaining shred of my restraint. I sat perfectly still in the darkness of my hotel room, the glow of the laptop screen casting a harsh light across my face. The toxicology report had ripped the blindfold from my eyes, replacing my profound grief with absolute rage. Derek and Valerie were not treating my daughter. They were dismantling her mind systematically, stripping away her consciousness with heavy chemical restraints. I turned my attention back to the high-definition video grid glowing on my monitor. It was midnight. The military-grade smart home surveillance system, the very system Derek thought he had disabled 7 years ago, was transmitting perfectly clear encrypted live feeds from every corner of the estate. I clicked on the feed labeled for the study, maximizing the window to fill my screen. I plugged my studio headphones in, pressing them tightly against my ears, bracing myself for whatever horrors the night would reveal. The study was illuminated by the soft glow of a single reading lamp on Derek's desk. For several minutes, the room remained entirely empty and utterly silent. Then the heavy oak doors swung open with a sudden, violent force. Valerie strode into the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She was not walking alone. Her left hand was tightly twisted into the thick roots of Maya's hair, forcefully dragging my frail daughter behind her. Maya stumbled over the threshold, letting out a weak whimper of pain, her skeletal frame practically swallowed by the oversized gray maid's uniform. Valerie did not show a single ounce of mercy. She yanked Maya's hair backward, forcing my daughter to her knees on the expensive Persian rug. "Stay right there and do not make a sound." Valerie hissed, her voice a cruel whisper that echoed perfectly through the hidden acoustic microphones. Maya simply bowed her head, her thin shoulders shaking violently, completely conditioned to submit. Derek emerged from the shadows near the wet bar, wearing his silk robe and a smug smile. He did not look at his wife kneeling on the floor. Instead, he casually picked up a crystal tumbler and filled it halfway with filtered water. He then reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small, unmarked prescription bottle. I held my breath, my fingernails digging into my palms, as I watched him unscrew the cap. He tapped 3 large, chalky white pills onto the polished bar top. Using the heavy bottom of a silver shaker, he expertly crushed the pills into a fine dust. He swept the white powder into the crystal glass, swirling the water until the toxic mixture dissolved into a milky liquid. Haloperidol and rohypnol, the exact chemical combination the laboratory had identified. He was preparing her nightly dosage of absolute oblivion, treating my brilliant daughter like a feral animal that needed to be put down. Derek walked slowly across the room, stopping directly in front of Maya. He stood over her, holding the clouded glass. "Drink it, Maya," he commanded, his voice dripping with a sickening sweetness. "It is time for your medicine. It will make all those bad thoughts go away completely." Maya squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face toward the floor, her whole body rejecting the command. "Please, Derek," she mumbled, her voice thick and slurred from the residual drugs already coursing through her battered system. "Please, it makes me feel so dark inside. I want to see my baby. I want to see Leo." The mention of her son caused Valerie to let out a sharp bark of laughter. Valerie stepped forward, her face twisting into a sneer. "You do not have a son, Maya," she spat cruelly. "You are crazy. You are just a crazy woman who makes up stories. Now open your mouth and take your medicine before I lose my patience." When Maya kept her mouth firmly closed, shaking her head weakly, Derek's fake smile instantly vanished. He dropped his hand, violently gripping Maya by the jaw. He squeezed her cheeks together with brutal force, forcing her mouth open while she let out a muffled cry of pain. Valerie stepped up behind her, grabbing her shoulders to hold her still. Derek tipped the crystal glass back, pouring the drug-laced water directly down my daughter's throat. He held her jaw clamped shut until she reflexively swallowed the bitter liquid, gagging and coughing as the poison hit her stomach. "Good girl," Derek mocked, finally releasing his painful grip. He stepped back casually, wiping a stray drop of water from his robe. Maya slumped forward, resting her forehead against the thick wool of the rug. Within moments, the massive dose of tranquilizers began to take hold. I watched through the hidden camera as Maya's body went completely limp. Her eyes rolled back slightly, losing the ability to focus. Valerie stood over her, crossing her arms with a look of supreme satisfaction. She nudged Maya's ribs with the point of her designer shoe. "Look at this pathetic mess," Valerie sneered, her voice echoing clearly through my headphones. "She is completely useless. Hey, crazy lady, since you are down there on the floor, you might as well make yourself useful. Look at the dust on these baseboards. It is absolutely disgusting. Scrub them right now or you will not get any breakfast tomorrow." Maya did not protest. Her chemically lobotomized brain simply accepted the cruel command. She reached into the pocket of her apron with agonizing slowness, her fingers trembling wildly as she pulled out a dry bristle brush. She dragged her body closer to the wall, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, and began to weakly scrape the brush against the wood. Derek and Valerie watched her perform this humiliating labor, exchanging a quiet, victorious laugh. Derek walked to his desk and pulled a leather briefcase from the drawer. He laid it flat and popped the golden latches. He pulled out a stack of documents bound with blue folders. I leaned closer to the monitor, straining to read the bold headers. It was a financial loan agreement. Derek flipped through the pages until he reached the final signature page. He grabbed a silver fountain pen and walked back to where Maya was kneeling. "Valerie, get her up," Derek ordered, his voice suddenly sharp. Valerie reached down, grabbing Maya by the shoulders and forcefully pulling her into a seated position. Maya's head lolled to the side, her heavily drugged eyes blinking sluggishly. Derek crouched beside her, placing the legal documents directly onto the Persian rug. This was the final financial blow. Derek was leveraging the value of the Hidden Hills estate to extract $5 million in untraceable cash. He took the silver pen and forcefully shoved it into Maya's right hand. Her fingers were completely limp, unable to grip the smooth barrel. The pen slipped, tumbling onto the rug. Derek let out an irritated sigh. He picked the pen back up and placed it into her palm once more. This time, he wrapped his own large hand entirely around her frail fingers, trapping the pen in a tight vice-like grip. With clinical precision, he physically guided her hand across the paper, perfectly forging her signature onto the loan. The second the blue ink dried on the heavy parchment, Derek dropped my daughter's limp hand in disgust. Maya immediately slumped to her side, sliding off the thick Persian rug and collapsing into a small, shivering pile against the dark mahogany baseboards. Her ragged breathing was the only sign that she was still alive. Derek did not spare her a single backward glance. He simply stood up, adjusted the collar of his silk robe, and handed the signed documents to Valerie. She took the papers with a triumphant smirk, carefully placing them back into the leather briefcase and snapping the golden latches shut. The sharp metallic click echoed through my studio headphones like the sound of a closing prison cell. Derek strolled confidently over to the wet bar, grabbing the same crystal champagne flute he had been drinking from earlier. Valerie joined him, leaning against the polished marble counter, as he poured them both a generous splash of vintage champagne. They clinked their glasses together, the delicate crystal chiming in the quiet study, celebrating their successful forgery right over my daughter's broken body. I sat in the darkness of my hotel room, my fingernails digging so deeply into my palms that I could feel warm blood welling up beneath the skin. I watched the live video feed with a cold, terrifying clarity, absorbing every single word they spoke. Derek took a long sip of his champagne, staring out the massive bay windows at the sprawling estate grounds. "I cannot wait to get out of this ridiculous house," he muttered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "I have always hated this place. It is too big, too isolated, and it constantly reeks of that pathetic oil money stench. Every time I walk through these halls, I feel like that old fool Harrison is breathing right down my neck. Valerie let out a soft, mocking laugh, trailing her manicured fingers down the lapel of his robe. "Well, you do not have to worry about the old man anymore," she purred, her tone venomous and sharp. "He is sitting in some cheap hotel downtown, completely oblivious, crying over his poor, sick daughter. We played him perfectly." Derek sneered, taking another aggressive sip from his glass. "He is a dinosaur, Valerie. A clueless, uneducated laborer who got lucky with a few smart investments. He spent 40 years freezing on an oil rig, inhaling toxic fumes, thinking he was building a legacy. He thought he could buy his way into high society by handing me the keys to this estate. He honestly believed I wanted to play the role of the devoted family man for the rest of my life. I never wanted his daughter. I just wanted the access." I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, the harsh blue light reflecting off my face. The depth of Derek's deception was staggering, but what he said next froze the blood in my veins. Valerie set her glass down and crossed her arms, her expression turning serious. "Are you absolutely certain the $5 million will be enough to call off the dogs?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh, anxious whisper. Derek ran a hand down his face, the smug confidence momentarily fracturing to reveal a deep, authentic panic. "It has to be enough," he replied, his tone suddenly tight and defensive. "You know exactly what those people are capable of doing." I lost everything, Valerie. Every single dollar of the firm's capital was wiped out in that massive cryptocurrency collapse. I thought I was making a genius play, a move that would make me richer than Harrison could ever dream. Instead, I ended up owing $7 million to a brutal Russian syndicate. They do not care about market fluctuations. They do not care about my apologies. They sent 2 men to my office last month, and they made it exceptionally clear that if I do not deliver $5 million in untraceable cash by the end of this month, they will kill me, and they will likely kill you too. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with devastating precision. Derek was not just a greedy, arrogant broker looking to steal my family fortune. He was a desperate, cornered rat, bleeding my estate dry to save his own miserable life from the Russian mob. The conservatorship was never about protecting Maya. It was a sophisticated, legally sanctioned mechanism to bypass the strict trust protocols I had established. By declaring me dead and having Maya legally deemed mentally incompetent, Derek had granted himself absolute, unfettered access to the equity of the Hidden Hills property. He was using the home I bought with my blood and sweat as a massive automated teller machine to pay off violent criminals. Valerie sighed, picking up her glass again. "We have worked too hard to let some foreign thugs ruin our plans," she said coldly. "We have kept her sedated for 2 years. We have hidden the boy. We fabricated the entire medical history. The bank has approved the home equity line of credit based on the conservatorship. With her signature on those final documents, the money is fully guaranteed." Derek nodded slowly, his eyes darkening as he looked over at Maya, who was still slumped unconscious against the wall. He walked slowly across the room, stopping just inches from my daughter's head. He looked down at her not with pity, but with pure, calculating malice. "Everything is finally falling perfectly into place," Derek stated, his voice ringing with a chilling, absolute certainty. "Saturday night is the grand charity gala downtown. We are going to attend. We will wear our best clothes, smile for the cameras, and officially announce the establishment of our new mental health foundation in honor of my tragically sick wife. We will impress the entire board of directors, solidifying my public image as a devoted, heartbroken caretaker. It is the ultimate cover story. No one will ever question a man who dedicates his life to charity." Then on Monday morning, I will walk into the bank, hand them this forged paperwork, and officially sign the loan documents. The $5 million will be wired directly into our offshore accounts by noon. He crouched down violently, grabbing a fistful of Maya's dark, tangled hair, yanking her head back so he could look into her lifeless, drugged face. And by Tuesday morning, he whispered, a sick, victorious smile stretching across his face, "Maya will be locked in a padded cell forever." I stared at the screen as Derek released his brutal grip, letting my daughter's head strike the floor with a sickening thud. The audio feed picked up his confident laughter echoing off the mahogany walls. He truly believed he had won. He believed he had successfully erased my bloodline to save his own miserable existence. But he did not realize that the old man he despised was watching his every move, capturing his entire confession on a secure digital server. Derek had given me the timeline, the motive, and the exact location for his final performance. I completely disabled the live feed screen, closed my heavy encrypted laptop, and slowly sat back in the deep shadows. The silence in the hotel room was absolute. I sat in the shadows, letting the horrifying reality wash over me. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a fully documented, indisputable fact. I packed my heavy encrypted laptop into my leather satchel. I placed the thick manila envelope containing the toxicology reports and the DNA results right next to it. In my breast pocket, resting over my heart, was the blood-stained cocktail napkin. I had the complete puzzle. I had the audio of Derek confessing to his massive cryptocurrency losses. I had the video of him chemically lobotomizing my daughter and forcing her to sign over the equity of the $8 million estate. I had undeniable proof of his ties to a brutal international crime syndicate. I zipped my jacket, walked out of the sterile hotel room, and drove straight back to the financial district as Los Angeles began to wake up around me. The morning sun felt very cold and distant. My mind was now singularly focused on the execution of my vengeance. I arrived at Jonathan's office tower just as the glass doors were unlocked for the day. I bypassed the receptionist, striding down the carpeted hallway with the heavy steps of a man marching to war. When I pushed open the heavy oak door to the corner office, Jonathan was not alone. Standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows was a tall, sharply dressed man with a stern, weathered face and a posture that radiated authority. Jonathan quickly stood up from his desk, gesturing toward the stranger. "Harrison Jonathan," said, his voice tense and hushed. "This is Special Agent Marcus Thorne. He is a senior operative with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically heading the Financial Crimes and Organized Syndicate Division. I called him the moment I verified the forged international death certificate in the county database. He has been tracking the Russian syndicate Derek mentioned for over 3 years." I walked over to the mahogany conference table in the center of the room. I unlatched my leather satchel and began to lay out my arsenal. I did not speak right away. I let the evidence do the talking. First, I placed the thick stack of rapid testing laboratory results on the polished wood. I pointed to the glowing yellow highlights indicating the massive sustained doses of haloperidol and rohypnol that were currently stripping away my daughter's mind. Next, I placed the DNA test, confirming that the little boy hidden in the house was my biological grandson. Then I reached into my jacket and gently laid the crumpled, blood-stained napkin on top of the medical files. Finally, I opened my laptop, entered my encryption keys, and played the audio and video recordings I had captured through the smart home surveillance network. Agent Thorne leaned over the table, his sharp eyes absorbing every detail. He listened to Derek's recorded voice confessing to the $5 million debt. He watched the clear, high-definition footage of Valerie violently dragging my frail daughter across the study floor. He saw Derek forcefully wrap his hand around Maya's limp fingers to forge the loan documents. The seasoned federal agent, a man who had likely witnessed decades of corporate greed and violent crime, clenched his jaw in visible disgust. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the video feed ended. Agent Thorne pulled his cell phone from his interior jacket pocket. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice firm and completely authoritative. "This is a severe active hostage situation, coupled with multi-million-dollar wire fraud and ties to a known violent syndicate. I am calling the regional field office right now. We are going to dispatch a tactical response team. We will breach the perimeter of the Hidden Hills estate within the hour. Secure your daughter and your grandson and put both Derek and Valerie in federal custody before noon." I stepped forward and slammed my clenched fist down onto the solid mahogany table. The loud, violent crack echoed like a gunshot through the quiet office, causing both Jonathan and Agent Thorne to jolt backward in surprise. "No," I growled, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that demanded absolute obedience. "You are not going to breach that house today. If you send a tactical team in right now, it is just a standard arrest. Derek will hire a team of expensive defense attorneys. He will claim the psychiatric medication was a miscalculation by a rogue nurse. He will spin the financial fraud as a desperate mistake under extreme duress from the cartel. He will drag my traumatized daughter through years of agonizing court battles. A simple morning raid is far too merciful for what they have done to my bloodline. I do not just want an arrest. I want total, absolute, and highly public annihilation." Agent Thorne lowered his cell phone, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the dangerous resolve burning in my expression. "You are playing a very risky game," Mr. Cole, Thorne warned calmly. "Your daughter is in severe physical and psychological danger. Every hour she remains in their custody increases the risk to her life. I know exactly what the risks are." I fired back, leaning heavily over the table until I was inches from the agent's face. I survived 40 years on the most dangerous offshore oil rigs in the world by anticipating the pressure, by knowing exactly when to vent the valves and when to let the fire burn. Derek is a narcissist. He operates entirely on ego-public perception and the illusion of absolute control. If we arrest him quietly in his pajamas on a Tuesday morning, he retains a shred of his dignity. We have to destroy him at the exact moment he believes he is a god. I pointed to the frozen video frame of Derek smiling in his silk robe. "Saturday night," I continued, my voice cold. "Derek is hosting a massive charity gala in the Grand Ballroom. He has invited the city's wealthiest developers, prominent brokers, and the board of directors for his fabricated foundation. He plans to stand on a brightly lit stage wearing a tuxedo and play the tragic husband raising money for his ill wife. He wants to secure his public image before he signs the $5 million home equity loan on Monday morning and locks my daughter in a state ward on Tuesday. I want to let him host that gala. I want to let him invite the absolute elite of the city. I want him to stand under those bright lights holding a crystal glass of champagne surrounded by applause at the untouchable peak of his arrogance. That is when I will rip the floor entirely out from under him." Thorne stared at me for a long moment. He looked down at the blood-stained napkin. He recognized the immovable force of a father seeking ultimate justice. "We have a deal, Mr. Cole," he agreed quietly. "We will let him have his grand stage. My federal agents will go undercover as the event staff. And when he takes the microphone, we will bring the curtain down." Saturday night descended upon the Hidden Hills estate like a heavy velvet curtain. The $8 million mansion was now glowing with the warm, artificial light of crystal chandeliers. I parked down the road and walked the rest of the way. The circular driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Ferraris and Bentleys glinted under the security lights. Valets hurried back and forth, opening doors for the absolute elite of Los Angeles. These were the wealthy developers, the prominent brokers, and the corrupt bankers Derek had invited to witness his grand performance. I bypassed the main iron gates entirely. I knew every blind spot, every shadow, and every hidden access point on this property. I slipped silently through the reinforced catering entrance at the rear of the kitchen, wearing a sharply tailored black suit that blended perfectly into the darkness. Inside the massive kitchen was a chaotic whirlwind of culinary activity. Undercover federal agents, dressed flawlessly as high-end catering staff, moved smoothly among the real chefs. They carried silver trays of expensive caviar and poured vintage wine, their eyes constantly scanning the room, waiting for the signal. One of the agents caught my eye. He gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. The trap was set. The guillotine was raised. I walked past the bustling prep stations and slipped through the swinging doors that led directly into the grand foyer. The transformation of my daughter's sanctuary into a playground for the rich made my stomach turn. A string quartet played a soft melody, drifting over the murmur of wealthy socialites mingling in designer gowns and custom tuxedos. I moved silently along the perimeter of the room, keeping my head down. I positioned myself directly behind a massive marble pillar near the base of the sweeping grand staircase. From this hidden vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. The sheer audacity of the event was sickening. Derek had spared no expense using the money he was stealing from my family to fund this lavish spectacle. He had erected a brightly lit stage at the far end of the room, framed by white roses. The low hum of polite conversation suddenly died down as the string quartet faded out. The sharp tapping of a spoon against a crystal glass rang out through the room. Derek stepped up onto the stage, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate, custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked impossibly handsome, radiating a manufactured aura of quiet strength and profound sorrow. He grabbed the microphone, looking out over the sea of wealthy faces, and offered a tight, brave smile that instantly captivated the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Derek began, his voice projecting smoothly through the speakers. He paused, letting his gaze drop to the floor for a calculated, dramatic second. "We are gathered here to celebrate the launch of a new mental health foundation, a cause deeply close to my heart. Many of you know my beautiful wife, Maya. What you may not know is that for the past 2 years, Maya has battled a severe psychological illness." Derek's voice cracked perfectly on the last word. He was a master manipulator, delivering a tear-jerking performance designed to secure his public image as a tragic, devoted husband. The crowd swooned, letting out soft murmurs of compassion. Women placed their hands over their hearts. Men nodded with grave respect. He stood under the lights, basking in their absolute adoration. "It has been a terrifying journey," Derek continued, wiping a fake tear from the corner of his eye. "Watching the woman I love slowly lose her grip on reality, watching her beautiful mind succumb to paranoid delusions, has been the greatest tragedy of my life. But I refuse to let her suffering be in vain. This foundation will ensure that families like mine do not have to fight this terrible darkness alone." He was at the absolute peak of his arrogance. He was twisting the horrific torture he was inflicting upon my daughter into a heroic narrative. The sheer magnitude of his evil was breathtaking. I stood frozen behind the cold marble pillar, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. I wanted to step out from the shadows right then. I wanted to walk up to that brightly lit stage, rip the microphone from his deceitful hands, and expose the monster hiding behind the designer tuxedo. But I forced myself to wait. Agent Thorne had insisted we needed Derek to feel completely untouchable before we brought the crushing weight of federal justice down upon his head. I shifted my gaze away from the stage, scanning the edges of the crowded room. My eyes locked onto a dark corner near the heavy doors leading to the kitchen. My heart stopped completely. Maya was standing there. She was heavily drugged, her skeletal frame practically swallowed by the degrading, oversized gray Maid uniform Valerie forced her to wear. She looked like a ghost haunting her own home. Her dark hair was tangled, hanging limply around her pale, sunken face. Her eyes were glassy and vacant, staring blankly at the polished marble floor. She was holding a massive silver tray loaded with towering crystal champagne glasses. Her thin, bruised arms were trembling violently under the heavy weight. Valerie must have forced her to work the party a sick power play to humiliate her in front of the city elite while Derek played the grieving husband on stage. Maya took a small, unsteady step forward. The potent cocktail of chemical restraints currently ravaging her brain made her feet drag clumsily against the smooth marble. She swayed dangerously. The silver tray tilted. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. The crystal glasses slid across the polished metal. Maya let out a soft, confused whimper as her frail hands gave out completely. The heavy silver tray crashed to the floor. Dozens of expensive champagne glasses shattered simultaneously, the violent, explosive sound tearing through the quiet, respectful silence of the ballroom like a bomb. Shards of sparkling crystal exploded outward in every direction, raining down across the pristine marble. The entire room went completely, utterly silent. The wealthy guests gasped, turning their heads in collective shock to look at the frail, shivering maid kneeling in the wreckage of broken glass. On the stage, Derek stopped mid-sentence. His fake, tragic smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered fury. His eyes locked onto Maya, the carefully crafted illusion of the loving husband, shattering just as violently as the crystal on the floor. He aggressively slammed the microphone onto the wooden podium, the feedback whining sharply through the speakers. He did not say a single word to the crowd. He marched down the wooden stairs of the stage, his fists clenched tight at his sides. The guests parted like the Red Sea, stepping back nervously as his heavy footsteps echoed across the room. He walked straight toward the dark corner where Maya was cowering among the broken glass. His face was twisted in a dark, violent rage, his right hand raising high into the air, ready to strike my completely defenseless daughter in front of 200 people. I did not think. I simply moved. The heavy years of hauling massive steel pipes, fighting the brutal ocean gales, and surviving the crushing physical demands of the offshore rig suddenly flooded right back into my tired veins. I stepped out from behind the cold marble pillar, crossing the polished floor with a terrifying, absolute silent speed. Just as his arm began its vicious descent, my hand shot out and clamped around his wrist like a vice of solid iron. The intense forward momentum of his cowardly strike collided perfectly with the immovable force of my grip. I squeezed his wrist. I did not just hold him back. I dug my calloused fingers deeply into his soft flesh, applying a brutal, heavily calculated pressure until I actually felt the bone beneath his skin begin to creak and give way. A sharp, incredibly pathetic gasp quickly escaped Derek's throat. The heavy, formal silence in the grand ballroom was instantly broken by his sudden, desperate intake of air. The furious, arrogant mask on his face shattered instantly. He jerked his head toward me, ready to curse the stupid caterer who had dared to touch him. But when his eyes finally locked onto my face, all the color violently drained from his skin. He looked exactly as if the solid marble floor had just opened up beneath his expensive leather shoes to swallow him whole. His mouth opened and closed silently, his eyes bulging with absolute, unadulterated terror. He was looking at a dead man. He was looking directly at the ghost he had legally manufactured, the man whose fortune he was actively stealing, standing right in front of him in the flesh. "Dad," he finally stammered, his voice incredibly weak, trembling, and completely stripped of its former theatrical authority. What are you doing here?" He tried to pull his arm away, but my grip only tightened, locking him in place. I ignored his pathetic question. I looked past him down at the floor where Maya was trembling among the sharp shards of broken crystal. Her glassy, unfocused eyes slowly drifted up to meet mine. Even through the heavy, suffocating fog of the chemical restraints they had forced down her throat, I saw a tiny, desperate flicker of recognition spark in her beautiful eyes. She let out a soft, confused sob, leaning her fragile body toward my legs, as if seeking shelter from a terrible storm. I stepped smoothly in front of her, placing my body completely between my vulnerable daughter and the monster who had enslaved her. A wave of frantic, confused murmurs rolled across the massive ballroom. The wealthy socialites, the prominent developers, and the corrupt bankers began whispering to one another, clearly disturbed by the sudden, highly unusual physical altercation interrupting their elegant evening. On the brightly lit stage, Valerie had frozen completely still, trapped perfectly in the blinding glare of the expensive spotlights. Her hands were gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly her knuckles were pure white. She stared down at me with wide, severely panicked eyes, realizing in a single second that their entire intricate web of deceitful lies was rapidly unraveling right before her. But Derek, ever the desperate narcissist, stubbornly tried to salvage his crumbling public performance. He swallowed hard nervously, clearing his tight throat, forcing a weak, incredibly fake smile onto his sweaty face as he turned his head toward the bewildered crowd of elite guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek announced, his voice shaking terribly as he tried to project over the rising murmurs. "Please do not be alarmed. This is an absolute miracle. This is my father-in-law, Harrison Cole. We were told he perished in a tragic offshore accident 2 years ago. I cannot believe my eyes. He has returned to us. He tried to laugh, a hollow, desperate sound that fell completely flat in the tense, heavy atmosphere. He looked back at me, his eyes silently pleading with me to play along with the charade, begging me to maintain the polite, civilized illusion of the grand charity gala. He was still trying to survive. He still believed he could talk his way out of the guillotine. I did not say a single word. I simply refused to dignify his absolutely pathetic, desperate performance with any kind of verbal response. I maintained my crushing, painful grip on his wrist, my eyes boring directly into his terrified soul. I slowly reached into the interior breast pocket of my customized, tailored black suit with my free hand. I pulled out my heavy cell phone. The screen was already glowing brightly with the master control interface of the estate's highly encrypted smart home network. Around the perimeter of the sprawling ballroom, I could see the undercover federal agents shifting smoothly into their tactical positions, their hands moving subtly toward their concealed weapons, waiting silently for my final signal. I looked directly at Derek, allowing a cold, merciless smile to touch my lips. I pressed a single bright, glowing red button on my phone screen. The entire digital architecture of the mansion engaged instantly. A series of heavy metallic thuds echoed in rapid succession around the massive room as the thick oak doors automatically slammed shut and the heavy electronic deadbolts locked firmly into place. The crowd gasped in collective shock as the exits were completely sealed. The soft, elegant music of the string quartet was abruptly cut off, replaced by the humming of the central audio system, rerouting its primary feed. All the ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed simultaneously, plunging the wealthy guests into a tense, shadowed twilight. Directly behind the wooden podium on the stage, the massive projector screen that had been displaying the fake, beautifully designed logo of Derek's Mental Health Foundation suddenly flickered. The bright white charity emblem completely vanished. The room plunged into absolute silence for a fraction of a second before the screen bloomed with high-definition video footage. It was the hidden camera feed from the mahogany study recorded just a few days ago. The massive speakers mounted strategically around the perimeter of the grand ballroom crackled to life, broadcasting the crisp, perfectly captured audio to every single person in the enclosed room. The 200 prominent guests stared in sheer, unadulterated horror as the crystal-clear video began to play. They watched paralyzed and completely silent as the massive 10-foot-tall projection showed Valerie violently dragging my frail daughter into the dark study by her hair. They heard Valerie's cruel, mocking voice echoing loudly off the walls, demanding that Maya scrub the wooden baseboards or starve. The collective gasp from the wealthy audience was deafening. I felt Derek's knees literally buckle beneath him as he watched his own giant image suddenly appear on the bright screen, casually crushing 3 heavy tranquilizer pills into a crystal glass of water. The pristine, heroic public facade he had just sold them burned to ashes in a single instant. The entire elite society of Los Angeles watched in breathless, absolute terror as the man on the screen brutally clamped his hand over my daughter's jaw, violently forcing the toxic chemical poison down her throat. The giant projection screen illuminated the ballroom with a pale light. Everyone stood completely paralyzed, their eyes locked on the undeniable evidence of pure evil playing out before them. The high-definition video shifted seamlessly from the dark mahogany study to the lavish master bedroom. The hidden camera captured Derek pacing across the plush carpet, holding his cell phone tightly to his ear. The massive surround sound speakers now broadcast his arrogant voice with crystal-clear precision. The audio bounced off the marble pillars, echoing loudly right in the center of my chest. I watched the very wealthy real estate developers instinctively recoil in sheer disgust. Derek's recorded voice boomed through the grand estate. "Listen to me," the digital phantom of my son-in-law demanded, his tone ruthlessly calculating. "I told you the capital is secure. Do not worry about the crazy wife." The entire ballroom let out a collective gasp. Women covered their mouths in horror, and men in custom tuxedos stared in stunned silence. The recording continued without a single ounce of mercy. Once we close the $5 million home equity line of credit next week, I am transferring her directly to a state ward. She will be locked away in a psychiatric facility kept completely sedated at all times. She will not be an issue for us anymore, and the old man is already legally dead and permanently buried deep in the system. The money will be wired directly into the offshore accounts by Friday. Just have the contracts ready for my signature. The audio feed cut to black, plunging the massive screen into darkness. The destruction of Derek's public image was instantaneous and catastrophic. The tragic husband narrative he had sold them burned to ashes right in front of their eyes. He was not a charitable hero raising money for mental health. He was a violent monster who had chemically lobotomized his wife to steal her fortune and pay off an international crime syndicate. The elite guests, the very people he had sought to impress, now looked at him as if he were a diseased animal. Disgust and anger radiated from every face in the crowd. They began murmuring loudly, backing away from the stage, creating a wide circle of isolation around the man they had just been applauding. On the brightly lit stage, Valerie finally snapped out of her paralyzed trance. The blinding spotlight highlighted the sheer panic completely overtaking her sharp features. She looked at the giant black screen, then down at the furious crowd, and finally at the heavily locked oak doors at the main entrance. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream, hiking up the skirt of her elegant evening gown, and scrambled frantically down the side stairs of the stage. She abandoned him instantly, sprinting madly toward the heavy swinging doors that led to the catering kitchen, hoping to find a hidden exit through the rear service corridors. She barely made it 10 feet across the polished marble floor. The elegant choreography of the grand charity gala suddenly shattered into highly orchestrated tactical chaos. The impeccably dressed waiters who had been quietly circulating through the wealthy crowd moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They simultaneously dropped their silver trays, letting the expensive food and crystal flutes crash violently against the floor. They reached beneath their crisp white catering jackets and pulled out heavy gold badges, securing them firmly to their belts. "Federal agents, get down on the ground right now!" A towering man in a waiter uniform bellowed, his voice carrying the absolute authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Valerie ignored the commanding shout, shoving her way past a terrified socialite in a frantic bid for the kitchen doors. 2 undercover agents sprinted forward, intercepting her path with tactical precision. They tackled her hard, bringing her down onto the cold marble floor with a heavy thud. Valerie shrieked wildly, kicking her designer heels and thrashing her arms like a cornered wildcat, but the agents expertly pinned her wrists behind her back. The sharp click of steel handcuffs ratcheting securely closed echoed over her desperate, sobbing protests. The FBI was completely in control of the room. Derek was hyperventilating wildly. He stood frozen near the edge of the stage, his chest heaving in rapid, shallow spasms. Sweat poured down his pale forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair and soaking the stiff collar of his tuxedo. He looked frantically at Valerie writhing on the ground in steel handcuffs, then at the federal agents securing the perimeter, and finally his wild, terrified eyes locked directly onto me. The immovable grip I had on his wrist just moments ago had completely shattered his reality, and now his mind was violently fracturing under the crushing pressure of his total exposure. He staggered backward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. His mouth opened, but only a pathetic, breathless wheeze came out. He desperately tried to reclaim the narrative, clinging blindly to the magnificent lie he had spent 2 years building. "He is an imposter!" Derek screamed, his voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed across the ballroom. "Listen to me, all of you. You have to listen to me. That man is an absolute fraud. My father-in-law perished in a catastrophic explosion. He is legally dead. He has been dead for 2 years. This is a sick, elaborate setup. Someone call the police right now. Arrest this man. He is a dangerous imposter trying to ruin my charity event." He spun around, looking desperately at the wealthy guests, practically begging them to believe his frantic delusions. But nobody moved. Nobody pulled out a phone to call the local authorities. They just stared at him with cold, unforgiving contempt. His hysterical screams hung in the air, pathetic and entirely impotent. I did not answer him. I did not need to lower myself to argue with a cornered, drowning rat. I simply stood there in my tailored black suit, my posture straight and immovable, radiating the cold certainty of a father who had returned from the grave to deliver my ultimate justice. Then the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open with a massive crash. Noise whipped every head toward the foyer. Stepping through the doorway, framed by the glowing crystal chandeliers, was Jonathan. My meticulous, fiercely loyal wealth management attorney looked like an executioner delivering the final blow. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two heavily armored United States Marshals, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the elegant evening wear of the charity guests. Jonathan strode confidently through the parted crowd, his leather shoes clicking against the marble. He did not look at the frightened socialites or the federal agents securing the room. His eyes were locked onto Derek, burning with decades of professional outrage. In his right hand, Jonathan held a thick stack of legal documents. The pristine white paper was bound by a thick seal displaying the undeniable authority of the federal court system. It was the original, unalterable trust deed to the Hidden Hills estate, completely nullifying the fraudulent conservatorship. The absolute end of Derek had finally arrived. Jonathan did not pause or hesitate as he approached the front of the grand ballroom. His polished leather shoes clicked with a steady, relentless rhythm against the marble, silencing the last remaining whispers of the terrified elite crowd. He stopped directly in front of the elevated stage, looking up at the trembling, sweat-soaked figure of my son-in-law. When Jonathan spoke, his voice was a sharp, booming baritone that echoed perfectly through the cavernous space, slicing through the heavy tension like a perfectly sharpened blade. "This property is exclusively owned by the Cole Family Trust," Jonathan declared, raising the thick stack of sealed federal court documents high into the air for every single guest to witness. "The conservatorship you have been operating under is entirely fraudulent. It was granted by a probate judge based solely on a heavily authenticated but entirely forged international death certificate. You have absolutely no legal claim to this estate, to its financial equity, or to the victim you have been holding hostage. Derek Preston, you are formally trespassing on my client's property, and your temporary reign of terror is officially over." Derek opened his mouth, but his throat was so paralyzed by pure, unadulterated fear that no sound emerged. He took a clumsy, stumbling step backward, his expensive leather dress shoes slipping slightly on the smooth stage floor. He looked wildly toward the heavy oak doors, desperately searching for any possible avenue of escape, but the two heavily armored United States Marshals immediately stepped forward, completely blocking the only primary exit. From the center of the room, Special Agent Marcus Thorne discarded the white catering towel he had been carrying over his forearm. He reached to his belt, unclipping his heavy gold federal badge, and held it up to the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. "Take him down right now," Agent Thorne commanded, his voice ringing with absolute immovable authority. 3 undercover federal agents immediately rushed the stage. They moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency, vaulting over the floral arrangements and grabbing Derek before he could even raise his hands to defend himself. They violently slammed him face first against the polished wooden podium, the heavy impact echoing loudly across the silent room. Derek let out a pathetic, high-pitched yelp as they forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The cold, sharp click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists sounded like the final definitive slam of a prison door. "Derek Preston," Agent Thorne announced, stepping up to the edge of the stage and looking down at the groveling, hyperventilating man. "You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are officially charging you with multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, international money laundering, false imprisonment, felony kidnapping, and the attempted murder of Maya Cole by sustained deliberate chemical poisoning." The wealthy socialites and prominent developers in the crowd gasped in unison, physically recoiling from the stage as the horrifying severity of the federal charges washed over them. The man they had just been applauding as a tragic devoted hero, was actually a calculating cold-blooded monster, and they had all been invited to witness his spectacular public execution. The federal agents yanked Derek to his feet, but his legs refused to support his weight. His knees buckled instantly, and he dropped heavily onto the edge of the stage, his tailored tuxedo pants tearing against the hard wood. The arrogant, smug broker who had confidently poured vintage champagne just 20 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place was a broken, sobbing, pathetic coward. Tears streamed rapidly down his pale, sweat-slicked face, ruining his carefully crafted image. "Harrison, please," Derek wailed, thrashing his head wildly from side to side, desperately trying to make eye contact with me. "Please, you have to listen to me. I never wanted to hurt her. I swear to God, I never wanted to hurt Maya. I was forced into this. The Russian syndicate threatened to kill me. They threatened to kill my family. I had to pay them back. I can fix this, Harrison. I can return the money. I will do anything you want. Just please call them off. Do not let them take me away. I beg you, have mercy on me." I did not yell. I did not scream or curse at him. The profound silence of the room amplified my heavy, deliberate footsteps as I walked slowly toward the stage. The elite crowd parted for me, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and deep, solemn respect. I stepped carefully over the sharp, glittering shards of broken champagne glasses, completely ignoring the stunned whispers of the wealthy socialites. I walked directly up to the edge of the wooden platform, stopping just inches away from Derek's violently trembling body. He looked up at me, his chest heaving with frantic, desperate sobs, his eyes begging for a shred of the paternal grace I had once freely given him. I stepped right over his groveling, pathetic form. I crouched down, balancing my weight on the toes of my steel boots, and brought my face incredibly close to his. I leaned in, ensuring that my words were meant for his ears and his ears alone. I lowered my voice into a chilling, absolute whisper that carried the full, devastating weight of my 40 years of hard, unforgiving labor. "You wanted to wash money for the brutal Russian cartel," I whispered, watching the raw, primal fear completely dilate his pupils. "You thought you could use the blood and sweat of my family to cover your pathetic, greedy mistakes, but you underestimated the man you tried to bury." I did not just find the hidden camera footage, Derek. I found the master files on your encrypted laptop. I found the actual unedited financial ledgers from your massive cryptocurrency failure. And I forwarded every single one of those digital files directly to the syndicate's local enforcers early this morning. I showed them exactly where their $5 million went. They know you lost their money. They know you never had the capital to pay them back. They know you are a complete fraudulent liability. Derek's breath hitched violently in his throat. The color drained from his lips, leaving them a terrifying shade of pale blue. His eyes widened to an impossible degree as the horrific reality of my words truly sank into his deeply fractured mind. "Enjoy. Federal prison. Derek." I whispered, maintaining my cold, unblinking stare as I delivered the final fatal blow to his existence. "It is the absolute safest place you can possibly be right now. Because if you ever manage to post bail, if you ever step one single foot outside of a concrete cell, those men will be waiting for you in the dark." I stood up slowly, straightening my tailored jacket, and smoothly turned my back on him. The sheer, overwhelming terror finally broke through the last remaining barriers of his sanity. He let out a deafening, blood-curdling scream of pure, absolute panic. The federal agents grabbed him by his ruined tuxedo and dragged his thrashing, screaming body forcefully out through the heavy oak doors into the cold night. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the chaotic nightmare outside. The federal agents efficiently cleared the grand ballroom, ushering the remaining shocked and bewildered guests out into the cold night air. Within minutes, the sprawling estate transformed from a frantic crime scene into a perfectly still sanctuary. The string quartet had long since fled, and the only sound left in the massive space was the gentle, rhythmic sweeping of a few agents carefully collecting the shattered crystal from the polished marble floor. I did not care about the mess or the lingering whispers of the elite socialites, who were now speeding away in their luxury cars. My singular focus was entirely on the dark corner of the room. I walked slowly toward the shadows, my heavy footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Maya was still huddled on the floor, shivering violently in her oversized, degrading gray maid uniform. She had pulled her knees tightly to her chest, her thin arms wrapped around her legs in a desperate, deeply ingrained posture of sheer self-preservation. The heavy chemical restraints Derek and Valerie had forced into her system were still clouding her mind, but the raw, unadulterated fear that usually paralyzed her features had begun to crack. I knelt down gently in front of her, ignoring the shards of glass digging into my tailored suit. I took off my heavy black jacket and wrapped it carefully around her trembling, fragile shoulders. The thick fabric engulfed her, offering a small, immediate layer of warmth and absolute safety. I reached out my calloused hands, gently brushing the tangled, damp hair away from her pale face. I did not speak right away. I just let her feel the undeniable physical proof that her father was truly there. Maya leaned her head against my chest, burying her face into my pristine white shirt, and let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like a soul finally being released from purgatory. A soft, hesitant patter of small feet suddenly echoed from the sweeping, grand staircase. I looked up. Standing on the bottom landing, rubbing his sleepy eyes, was a tiny, incredibly confused little boy. He was wearing faded cotton pajamas, his dark hair messy from sleep. He looked around the vast, empty ballroom, staring at the federal agents and the broken glass before his innocent, wide eyes finally landed on us. He had likely been locked away in a dark upstairs room for the entire evening, hidden from the world like a shameful secret. Maya lifted her heavy head, her glassy eyes suddenly filling with a fierce, desperate maternal clarity. She reached a trembling hand out toward the stairs. "Leo," she whispered, her voice incredibly weak and raspy from disuse, but laced with profound love. I stood up slowly, keeping one protective hand firmly on my daughter's shoulder, and walked over to the staircase. I crouched down to the little boy's eye level. He looked at me with a mixture of innocent curiosity and gentle apprehension. He had the exact same deep, soulful brown eyes as his mother. I reached out, wrapping my strong, steady arms around his small frame, and picked up my grandson for the very first time. He felt incredibly light, but holding him anchored my soul completely. I carried him back across the marble floor and gently placed him directly into his mother's waiting arms. Maya pulled him against her chest, burying her tear-stained face into his soft hair. The three of us sat there on the cold marble floor of the grand foyer, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of Derek's deceitful empire finally united. 3 months passed. The transition from a chaotic living nightmare back into a peaceful, dignified reality was a slow, incredibly deliberate process. The Hidden Hills mansion, once a terrifying prison of chemical restraints and psychological torture, had been entirely purged of its dark history. The federal authorities had formally seized all of Derek's remaining fraudulent assets. He and Valerie were currently sitting in maximum security federal holding cells, awaiting a heavily publicized trial that would undoubtedly send them away for decades. The Russian syndicate had completely abandoned him, leaving him isolated, terrified, and totally exposed. We were sitting on the expansive rear patio of the estate, bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of fresh, blooming jasmine and eucalyptus. Maya had just returned home the previous week from a highly specialized private detoxification rehabilitation center. The agonizing, deeply complex process of safely flushing the heavy sedatives and dangerous antipsychotics from her delicate system had been a monumental battle. But she had fought with the quiet, unyielding strength she inherited directly from my bloodline. I sat comfortably in a plush outdoor armchair, a steaming cup of dark coffee resting on the small table beside me. I watched my daughter through the open glass doors of the grand living room. She was sitting gracefully at the black grand piano, her posture perfectly straight, her eyes clear, bright, and deeply focused. She was not a maid anymore. She was not a medicated ghost haunting her own hallways. She was the absolute, undisputed master of her house. Her slender fingers danced smoothly across the ivory keys, playing a soft, beautiful, and incredibly complex melody that drifted effortlessly out onto the sunlit patio. Out in the sprawling manicured garden, little Leo was running wildly across the pristine green grass. He was chasing a brightly colored ball, his loud, carefree laughter echoing cheerfully through the warm evening air. Jonathan had secured the boy's legal status completely, ensuring that Derek's name was permanently scrubbed from all parental rights and custody agreements. The dark cloud that had suffocated this property was entirely gone. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow, deep breath of the fresh Los Angeles air. I looked at the solid, beautiful architecture of the $8 million mansion, knowing that the empire I had built with decades of my own blood, sweat, and physical suffering was finally safe. The massive wealth I had accumulated was no longer a target for greedy, parasitic monsters. It was a secure, heavily fortified fortress for the people I loved most in this world. The profound peace that settled over the estate was the ultimate, undeniable victory. Evil rarely kicks down your front door wearing a mask. It usually walks right in with a warm smile, wearing a tailored suit, demanding your trust. I spent my life drilling through hard ocean rock, thinking the greatest dangers were out in the wild, only to find that the most lethal monsters sit at our dinner tables. Never ignore the quiet alarms your instincts raise. Blood may make you related, but loyalty, fierce protection, and absolute truth are what make a family. Protect your legacy, because if you do not fiercely guard what is yours, a smiling wolf gladly will. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be a wolf in hiding? How did you uncover their malicious lies? Please share your story in the comments below. Your personal experience might just save someone else. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more justice and survival stories.